I'm Michael Hull, and I want to tell my story about being a Cumberland Presbyterian and growing up in the church and being a gay person as an adult. I was literally born into the family of Cumberland Presbyterians. My maternal grandfather was Roy Sheldon, and he was a Cumberland Presbyterian minister, mostly in Southern Illinois, and he had 9 children. 4 of the 5 girls married ministers, and 2 of the 4 boys became ministers. A third of the sons became a church organist, and he joined the Episcopal Church, but stayed in the church until he died. And my father's side was from Marshall and Longview, Texas, and both my paternal grandfather and paternal grandmother, Addie Bell McLaren Hull and Noble Hull, had been Cumberland Presbyterians in their family for generations. We have historical documents where my grandmother was teaching Sunday school at the Marshall Church when she was a youngster at the turn of the last century. And my father was baptized into the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Dallas. At the time, the church was right around the corner from where my grandparents lived. And he and his brother, Tommy Joyce Hull, went to church there before the church moved to Garland because of the urban flight and the suburbanization of a lot of that community. And then Uncle Tommy and Aunt Wilma remained parishioners at the church in Garland until they died. And their daughter, Cindy, was also a member there. And I have a cousin on my mother's side who's a member of that church to this day. I also have cousins who became ministers. David Smith, Mary Beth Smith married Jim McGuire, who was at the denominational headquarters in education for years, and he was my Sunday school teacher when I grew up in Memphis. Jeff Knight also became a minister, and he's active in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church now as a leader. And his sister, Susan, is also on the staff of the denominational headquarters as the archivist, and her husband, Matt Gore, is the editor of the Cumberland Presbyterian now. So I say all this not because I want to prove my bona fides as a Cumberland Presbyterian, but to really highlight that I grew up believing that the church was the family, and my family literally was the church, and our home was the church buildings. We mowed the grass like many of you. We cleaned the church on Saturdays. We painted Sunday school rooms. And we used to joke that our family, because my father was a preacher, we were like a pop-up church. My father could preach, my mother could sing and play the piano, and the boys would collect the offering and light the candles and fold the bulletins. And all of that became very important to me throughout my childhood, but not just because my family was the clergy family, but because the church itself became my family. So the parishioners were my family. They nurtured me, they cared about me, they watched us when our parents weren't available. So I grew up with Miss Annie Mary Springer and Miss Lurleen and Mr. Flanoy and Stripling McLean, and I can name countless people who helped rear us. Also, the denominational headquarters was in Memphis, and my father worked for the Board of Stewardship. So we also had people that they had gone to school with at Bethel College and had graduated in seminary, and those church leaders were also our family, and they taught us and nurtured us about God's love and the importance of Jesus in our lives, commitment to the church. We didn't have recreation in the sense that children do now. We went to church. We looked forward to going to Sunday school. We looked forward to having choir practice on Thursday nights. We went to prayer meeting on Sunday nights. We went to prayer meeting on Wednesday nights. And we spent Saturdays preparing for Sundays when we went to help clean up the church. As I became an adolescent, I became more and more aware that I was gay. I can't say that I was able to pronounce that. I was born in 1956. We had lived through the sexual revolution of the 70s. I was in high school in the early 70s, and I became more and more aware of my sexuality. And my parents were sensitive to that. They were sensitive to that from an early age. I was a bit prissy. I'm not one of those people who can say, I'm just like everybody else. I play baseball. I can kick a football, all that kind of stuff. I preferred to sing. I preferred to knit and to sew. I remember one of my favorite stories as a really young child. I was in preschool, and I liked to go roller skating. And I told my mother that I liked the skating skirts because they had these little cute skirts, and they had bloomers underneath them that either contrasted or blended. And so she had one of the church members make me a skating skirt. And she wasn't timid about that. She wasn't embarrassed by who I was. She wasn't embarrassed that I was attracted to nurturing dolls or being good with the young children in the nursery school. She promoted that because she could see that that's who I was. Whether or not that were identified as gay or not was irrelevant to her. She wanted me to be who I was. I had two older brothers, and they were encouraged to be who they were, and they're quite different now than they were different then. But the church was always a part of that. I remember going to summer camps, participating in Vacation Bible School, and in CPYC, as I became more of a teenager, more aware of who I was as a person, I took time to talk to Frank Ward, to Roy Blakeburn, people who were caring and knew me and knew my family and knew what was important to me. And they taught me about grace, and they taught me about love. My father preached many sermons about the nature of grace, and he taught us that God's grace is not something that we earn, not necessarily something that we deserve, but Jesus loves us to the fullest, so that he wants us to become who we are. So when I went to college, my first year, I met a man. He was in the pulpit and I was in the choir loft, and he was preaching on Gay Pride weekend at Northwestern University, and I was singing in the choir. And afterwards, we went to a discussion group about sexuality, about homosexuality, and I recognized that this felt right. And so that community within the chapel of the university there helped me come to terms with who I was and to talk about that in terms of my faith, because my faith is very important to me, and my understanding of God and Jesus in my life is very important to me. That summer I went home, and my mother met me on the sofa one Sunday afternoon. And Sunday afternoon for clergy families is often a time for naps, and mother and dad always napped on Sunday afternoon. So I knew there was something ominous about her being there. And she asked me if I were gay, and I told her that I was, and she called my father and we sat and talked about it. And of course, they shared their honest feelings about being concerned about me. It was before the AIDS crisis, but certainly there were dangers of discrimination, and their feeling that I was destined to be lonely and isolated, and that gay, though it meant something positive to me, connoted for them something that was tragic or sad. My mother expressed this sadness that she might not have grandchildren, which was a big thing for her, and that she'd always thought of me as someone who was very kind and nurturing to children, and she wanted me to have that opportunity to be a parent. And I reassured them that as far as I knew, things were going well, and that I wasn't making any final decisions about the rest of my life. I was making decisions about who I was and whom I wanted to become, just like I was with my profession, just like I am continuing to do with my faith, just as I am with all of my hobbies and all my interests and the friendships that I developed. And there too, I found in that community a very welcoming, warm, gay community that had been through this before with other people, and they wanted to be a part of supporting me, and they wanted me to talk through the concerns that I had, and also to really embrace the gayness of being gay. I when I talk like this, I feel like I'm kind of a novelty. And after 45 years of discovering myself, it's kind of odd that I still have to be on a video camera talking about who I am. It seems somewhat artificial, but I don't mind because it's a true reflection of what God's given me and whom I've become. So that man that I met in the pulpit, his name is Robert, and he had a vocation to become an Episcopal priest. He had been in seminary at Notre Dame and had gone to novitiate and left the Roman Catholic Church for lots of reasons. And he had found a home in the Episcopal Church in his vocation, and he was called to seminary. So we went to seminary together in Boston, and our lives continued to blossom. It was a very welcoming community. They were very supportive of a same-sex relationship that was committed. This was an era when gay people didn't often have long-term relationships, and by that time we'd been together 6 or 7 years, and the community really was proud of that. And then Robert went on to be ordained as a priest. He took his first church in Rhode Island, and I started a career in mental health services and as a social worker. After a few years, he moved to a new church in Connecticut, and I moved with him. And that first year, there was a big crisis in our particular parish, and the parish split in two, and about our sexuality. It was a very hurtful time because we'd developed friendships with all of these people, and they had called us there, and I was teaching Sunday school. I was a part of the choir, and half of the parish felt that it was inappropriate to have a gay priest. They called the bishop in, and we had a big meeting and a vote, and they voted to have Robert remain as the priest. He remained in that parish for 20 years. And during that time, I decided I was going to pursue becoming a parent. So in 1990, I became a foster parent with the idea of becoming an adoptive parent. And at that time, two same-sex people could not adopt as a couple. And so I adopted Sean Patrick, our son, in 1990. And he then and now is the joy of our life. We spent a lot of time caring for him. He was special needs and was referred to as a hard to place child. But as soon as he came to live with us, he flourished. He had been thrown out of 3 previous adoptive homes. And the social worker and his school teacher saw that there was something wrong and asked if he could be removed from their care, the last foster parents, and placed with us. And they insisted that they not have him come live with us until the teacher and his social worker met us, and they endorsed the placement. And then within a year, we had him evaluated. And one of the greatest moments was when the psychologist was giving the presentation, and he said that Sean Patrick already had a sense of a true family, and that he had pronounced to them that he was lucky because he had 2 dads and 2 dogs. At the adoption, the judge asked him if he knew what was happening. He was 7 at the time, and he has special needs, so he wasn't a sophisticated 7-year-old. And he said, yes, it means that I'm going to be with Michael and Robert forever. And the judge says, do you know what forever is? And he says, yes, 10 million years. And so we were, from that point on, a family. And Sean Patrick still lives with us. He now has a girlfriend who 3 years ago moved in with us. And she has a 5-year-old who at that time was 1. And Olivia is a very important part of our lives. I tell people that gay people aren't supposed to have children, let alone grandchildren. I've lived long enough to enjoy both. My mother came to live with us after my father died, and she lived in the household with us. Nothing brought her more joy than to be with Sean Patrick. So one of the things that I thought about when I was asked if I wanted to present my story, and when I went before the committee before, I reflected on the confession of faith, because I'm no longer a part of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, but I still feel as if I'm a Cumberland Presbyterian. When people ask me, and they say, "You live in New York," and I say, "Yes, but I'm always a Southerner." And they say, "But you're an Episcopalian." And I say, "Yes, but I was born into the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and I'll always be a Cumberland Presbyterian." So I went back to the confession of faith, and I thought about the kinds of things that my father had taught me, about grace and about God and about God's love. And I found 3 articles that I thought were very important. One of them is Article 4.22, and it says, "As believers continue to partake of God's covenant of grace, to live in the covenant community, and to serve God in the world, they're able to grow in grace and the knowledge of Jesus Christ as Lord. Believers never achieve sinless perfection in this life, but through the ministry of the Holy Spirit, they can be progressively conformed to the image of Jesus Christ, thereby growing in faith, hope, love, and other gifts of the Spirit." The following article, 4.23, says, "The struggle with sin continues, for believers are still imperfect in knowledge and the power to do God's will. Their freedom to trust, love, and serve God and neighbors is compromised sometimes by distrust, hate, and selfishness. Their inner struggle drives them again and again to rely on God's power to conform them to the image of the new person in Jesus Christ." Article 6.15 says, "God created the family as the primary community in which persons experience love, companionship, support, protection, discipline, encouragement, and other blessings." One of the arguments against accepting gay people into the Christian community is that it's perceived as a sin, by what the writings in the Bible. There are a lot of theologians that can argue against that or for that. But I believe the prevailing message of the Gospels is that God is love, and God endures, and God wants us to be who we are. I believe that. I was taught that. That's how I read this confession. And I also ponder the concept of sin and where is the gradation of sin. I admit that I'm a sin-filled person. One of my biggest sins is that I can be quite judgmental myself, that I can be reactive, that I can get angry, that I can speak evil of other people. There are sins in my life that are much worse than the possibility that my love for my husband is sin-filled. And I think that regardless, God says to me that God's grace is sufficient to redeem me, whoever I choose to be or whomever I think God made me to be. I truly believe that. So my mother and my father are buried in the Cumberland Presbyterian Cemetery in McKenzie, the Shiloh Church, where my cousin Jim McGuire was the pastor for quite some time, while my cousin Mary Beth was the dean of Bethel College. And they're buried there with many of their friends. And when I think about my parents, I think mostly about my father in the pulpit, my mother singing. One of my favorite songs, and my mother and I used to do a lot of singing. We'd go to Sacred Harp singings and sing shape notes, and we did special numbers since the time I was 4 or 5 years old in church. My cousin Susan Gore recently posted some pictures of some photographs of family reunions and some funerals, and she posted the program for a funeral for my oldest uncle. My oldest aunt's name was Juanita and her husband was Russell. And at that funeral, it says that I sang Wondrous Love. The epitaph on my parents' grave is, "What wondrous love is this, that caused the Lord of bliss to bear the shameful cross for my soul." And the ending of it says, "When from death I'm free, I'll sing on, I'll sing on." And that's how I think of God. That's how I think about the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. That's how I think about my faith, full of wondrous love. Wondrous in the sense that it's awesome, but it's also mysterious and something that I cannot define or constrain. Thank you.